Okay, I'm just continuing the lecture from last time, so let me remind you where we were. And again, I had said there were 3 debates, so I'm following the same sets of issues through, whether socialization creates unitary or modular, whether essentially the consciousness or the brain or social experience creates sort of a unitary self versus modular kinds of human beings that have different parts that basically do different things and get activated in different situations. The second debate was whether socialization creates deeply internalized motives or personality traits or whatever, or whether the things that we learn socially operate largely through more superficial characteristics of the person. And the third debate was whether, or it's not really just whether, it's which aspects of socialization are enduring and permanent and which are malleable. And I tried to make the point that while we tend to assume that unitary, deep, and enduring go together, and modular, superficial, and malleable, and everybody knows what malleable means? Changeable. So something that's malleable is like clay, and you can remold it. That's the... Okay, I hope my mic is not going to act up. And so I tried in the 2 examples at the end of last lecture to point out that traits people assumed when they found them in women, like fear of success, were deeply internalized and lasting, turned out to be essentially both men and women reporting on what they saw the realistic expectations women versus men might have about their lives if they were very, very successful in medical school, right? So something that was assumed to be unitary, deep, internalized, lasting might actually be much more a matter of social circumstance. And in fact, I told you that these findings disappeared over time as women's actual situation changed. And then this was a different kind of study that argued that basically all the differences between men and women in corporations, between their behaviors, their personality styles, and so forth, were due to the structural positions they found themselves in, and not at all due to anything they carried with them because of their gender, okay? And now I'm going to try to, I hope not confuse you more, but show you some of the research that suggests both that some of these traits that are different in women and men actually are quite enduring and important, but not because they are deeply internalized differences in motives. So that's really the bottom line here. So let me repeat it. That some of the differences between women and men that seem to be fairly consistent and persistent, so they last over time and across different situations, are not due to deeply internalized differences in personality or motivations, or I could add biology, okay? And I'm going to try to make that case by talking about some interesting pieces of research. And I've called this in between inside and outside. And what I'm really pointing to is, and this you should have from Goffman, and again, this will also link, I think, to the book you're reading for next week, which you're really going to enjoy, Unequal Childhoods. That there's a level at which we are shaped socially that is not deep inside our emotions and our personalities and our, deep inside our fundamental feelings and attitudes toward the world, but also not superficial, like you can take it on and off the way you would a hairstyle or a clothing style. They are, I would say, a little deeper than skin deep, because, and this theme will come out more during the lecture, but they are things like habits, skills, and styles that are actually quite hard to learn, They are usually, though not always, learned almost unconsciously. And once you have them, they are the basic resource you bring to bear in any new situation, because that's how you know how to get along. That's how you know how to manipulate your world. That's how you know to get other people to cooperate with you. And so I'm going to argue that styles, skills, and habits are really much more important than we usually recognize in shaping behavior consistently over time. Then I'm going to look at the importance of identity, which is a feature that's more deeply anchored, but, and I'll try to make this case, doesn't always have consistent effects across situations. And then I'm going to look at some of the differences in men's and women's situations that might account for some of these differences in style, skills, habits, and the way identity works. Okay, so to start with style, skills, and habits, there is a lot of work, and some of it is quite fun to read. So Deborah Tannen is a very popular linguist. She's a serious academic scholar, but she also has great personality and presentation of self, and she, I think, had a series on educational TV where she talked about these issues. And she has a book called He Says, She Says, and another book that's kind of, it's not this, but it's one of these women are from Venus, men are from Mars kinds of books. But what she looks at are the different conversational styles of women and men. And a sociologist named Candace West has looked at a very similar phenomenon. So how do women and men talk differently? And what Candace West did was, in a student coffee house, she surreptitiously recorded conversations between women and men. And these were often boyfriend-girlfriend pairs, but they could have been just friends. And it turns out, and some of you will recognize this, that not always, this is not true of everyone, but typically, while women are talking to someone, they make a whole series of sounds that are approving, reassuring, agreement. So they basically are going, oh, uh-huh, oh, uh-huh, uh-huh, oh, yeah, yeah, uh-huh, oh, wow, yeah, uh-huh. Response, response, response. So encouraging the other person. Essentially, you just told me something, a little more, a little more, a little more. Men, when they are engaged in a conversation, even one they are actually listening to, often delay responding. So the young woman, these were recorded conversations, again, of students about your age. The young woman is talking, and she may be saying, oh, and I just had so much fun this weekend. And then maybe, uh-huh, right? But beat, 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 beat. And she shows that, first of all, this is one of the typical, stereotypical complaints that wives have about their husbands, girls have about their boyfriends. I don't know how this works out in same-sex couples. It'd be very interesting to know. Actually, that'd be if somebody could do that research somehow, that would be a huge contributor. That is, when it's two men, do they both act like men? So one says something and the other one delays 3 seconds and then grunts. Or does one of them or both take up the role of going uh-huh, 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 and being very encouraging? But these differences they actually create consequences, because that delay of several beats in response is often interpreted as disapproval. So the young woman will say, ooh, I heard about this really good movie and it'd be very fun to go. Uh-huh. And she says, okay, but if you don't want to go, I mean, we don't have to go. Uh-huh. And so the difference in stylistic pattern turns out to be very consequential. It is related to some other things, which is that all female conversations tend to jump around a lot and be on lots of different topics, but with lots of this encouragement. And male interactors tend to be more, I don't know what to call it, business-like. That is, they communicate from point A to point B to point C, and then they're done. There's also a lot of data. Women like talking on the phone more than men do. And then I'll use some of the Deborah Tannen ones, which slip a little bit from linguistic differences to other differences, but I can't resist talking about this one, which she does talk about, which is women appear to enjoy asking for help. So if you are lost, you surely have had this situation, or you probably don't now that you have GPS. Actually, a very important sex difference might disappear. But I don't know if you've heard the joke about why did Moses and the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years? Because Moses didn't want to ask for directions. Okay, and that is in fact, typical difference, that women don't mind appearing helpless, and so they willingly ask for directions or ask for help or ask for advice, and men resist. Again, not everyone, but typically men resist asking others for advice. And there's all sorts of speculation that it makes the man feel one down, whereas women are busy affiliating, and so they don't mind that experience. But in any case, you really do get different styles of talk, and again, they turn out to have real consequences in the form group interaction takes. The second is a fascinating finding, and this has to do with these cooperation games that social psychologists love to run, and the old game is Prisoner's Dilemma, and that's the one which I'm sure you already know about in principle, but it's called Prisoner's Dilemma because it's like in a cop show where you have two people who've been arrested who you believe committed a crime together, and you put pressure on each one of them saying, whoever breaks first and tells me what really happened is going to get off with an easy sentence, and the one who holds out and keeps lying about this is going to the slammer for life, right? And so if both people hang together and neither of them breaks and talks to the cop, they both get off, because the cops can't prove they did it. So cooperation is the smartest strategy. But if you think the other person is going to rat on you, or in the cop shows at least, the police lie and claim the person has already ratted on you, then you are much better off to be the first one to break and tell the police what really happened and let the other person go down. So that is the classic structure of a prisoner's dilemma game. When social psychologists run these, they run them as systems of joint payoffs. So it's usually done with money or something like money. And the idea is that, and you can vary how big the difference is between cooperating and not cooperating. So if you cooperate, you each get $5, but if one of you basically betrays the other will get none, and you will get 10, something like that. So, and you can vary those benefits to make cooperation the best strategy, non-cooperating at all different levels. What turned out that when they were running these experiments a couple of decades ago, and I don't know what the current situation is, men behaved in what you would call a rational way. That is, they, depending on what the payoffs were, they cooperated, or non-cooperation is called defecting. So they cooperated or defected pretty predictably, depending on what the rewards were for cooperating versus defecting. Women appeared not to behave rationally according to the way the experimenters were thinking about the study design. Why? The way women behaved was that if the other person in the game behaved cooperatively toward them, they would then, in the next round or the next round or the next round, even if the payoffs for being essentially mean to that person were huge, they would keep cooperating. So once the other person, in other words, had been I'll use the term nice, then they would sacrifice big payoffs in order to keep the solidarity going. And if the other person had defected on them in the first round, because that was the structure of the payoffs, they would non-cooperate even when it hurt them, right? So essentially, they were nice if the other person was nice, and they were not nice if the other person was not nice. Now, one way to look at this, and I think this was how social psychologists looked at it, was that men were behaving rationally in the game, and women were being irrational and emotional. But in fact, another way to think about this is that the men took the game very seriously. They stayed inside the game. They behaved according to the rules of the game that the social psychologists had set up in a lab. The women treated this as an actual relationship to another person. So they didn't follow the game. They followed a set of implicit rules that organize friendly interactions with people who might in fact become friends. And so in a way you could say the women were smarter, which is that they didn't take the game as defining reality. They took the relationship, which after all, you are there with another person having an actual interaction, and they interacted. So it's a difference in style that was quite consequential, or a difference in expectations, or a difference in, I don't even quite know what to call it, but the level at which they entered the situation and their willingness to kind of suspend the interactional reality in favor of a formally defined reality versus their defining the interactional reality as what was real. So I think what you would say is the women were more likely to define the interactional reality as real. The men were more likely to define the game as real. And then the third, and this is, well, I'll just say it's not good social science. That is, I'm spending a lot of time, you haven't seen this yet, but I'm going to try to persuade you over the course of the course that it really matters to have good systematic evidence for claims. This is a book by Carol Gilligan called In a Different Voice, and it has sold, I don't know, 1 million or so copies. It's incredibly influential, relatively early feminist work that has had enormous influence in the social sciences. And she is a very interesting person. She's a social psychologist, but she has a lot of background in philosophy. And so she developed some concepts in this book that have actually become central in contemporary philosophical debates about ethics. So when you hear people talking about using the word care and talking about things like care work, that terminology comes straight out of this book. So it's an old book, but there's now a whole subfield of sociology about care and care work. And the language and the idea, and I'm going to get to the idea in a second, come out of this. So I'm going to tell you briefly what she did. She also was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg, the person I mentioned in the last lecture, who developed the cognitive developmental theory of sexual socialization. Well, Kohlberg is most famous, in fact, for his work on the development of morality in children. And what he did that, again, was enormously influential is develop a set of 6 vignettes, little stories, and ask children how they would solve these moral dilemmas. And he had a very complex system of scoring the way children answered. So I'm going to tell you the classic. There are several of them, but the one that became most famous is the story of Heinz. So don't ask why this person appears to be Swiss, but anyway, because the research was done in America. But anyway, Heinz has a wife who is dying of cancer. And there is a drug that could save her, but it costs, and at that you have to put this back in time, but it costs $1,000, and he does not have and cannot get $1,000. Should he steal the drug to save his wife? And then when the children answered, this, we're also done with adults, but originally with children, they would probe and say, well, why? Why do you think that? And so Kohlberg developed a notion that there were stages of moral development. And essentially in early childhood, what all children thought about was punishment. And what was right was what would keep you from being punished, but if you would get caught, it was wrong. And levels 1 and 2 were at that level. Then there was a higher level, which was sort of social utilitarianism. Well, he shouldn't steal the drug because if everyone stole things all the time, that would be terrible, right? Or he should steal the drug because, I don't know, people should always, anyway, there was a sort of a way of thinking about it that no matter which side you took was a kind of, let's do on average what's the best thing for society, kind of something like that. And then the highest level, according to Kohlberg's understanding of this, was when Heinz could stand up to society and say, the supreme value is the value of human life. Nothing is more important than that. And so he should steal the drug because this is morally right. And this came out of Kantian ethics and was considered the highest level of moral development. And not even many adults did not get there, but that was the way this was understood. Gilligan got interested in the way men and women and boys and girls answered this differently. And she argued that women came off as less morally developed than men. So typically men were more likely to get to this 6th highest stage. But she argued that was because there was essentially a masculine bias built into the whole way the thing was set up. And so I'm going to read you a little bit of her book because, and again, you remember the story, so Heinz, the drug, the wife is going to die if he can't get the drug and he can't afford it. And she compares 2 11-year-old children who answered these questions, and these are both kids from privileged backgrounds. This was done in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she was at the Harvard Ed School. And so these are, you know, privileged kids who are very sure of themselves, and they sound like little grown-ups to me. But anyway, so she says, Jake, at 11, is clear from the outset that Heinz should steal the drug. Constructing the dilemma, as Kohlberg did, as a conflict between the values of property and life, he discerns the logical priority of life and uses that logic to justify his choice. So here's what Jake says. For one thing, a human life is worth more than money. And if the druggist only makes $1,000, he is still going to live. But if Heinz doesn't steal the drug, the wife is going to die. And the interviewer asks, why is life worth more than money? Because the druggist can get $1,000 later from rich people with cancer. But Heinz can't get his wife again. Why not? Because people are all different. And so you couldn't get Heinz's wife again. And so she sees this as this extraordinarily logical, sort of coherent answer. I'll go on a little bit more. Asked whether Heinz should steal the drug if he does not love his wife, Jake replies that he should, saying that not only is there, quote, a difference between hating and killing, but also if Heinz were caught, quote, the judge would probably think it was the right thing to do. Asked about the fact that in stealing, Heinz would be breaking the law, he says, quote, the laws have mistakes, and you can't go writing up a law for everything that you can imagine. Okay. Then she comes to, I have to find the name of Amy. So another 11-year-old, same school, same kind of background. And she says, in contrast, Amy's response to the dilemma conveys a very different impression. An image of development stunted by a failure of logic, an inability to think for herself. Asked if Heinz should steal the drug, she replies in a way that seems evasive and unsure. Well, I don't think so. I think there might be other ways besides stealing it. Like if he could borrow the money or make a loan or something. But he really shouldn't steal the drug, but his wife shouldn't die either. So what do we see here? It's actually quite similar to what I said earlier about the cooperation games, which is she's somewhat breaking the rules. That is, she isn't sticking to the two alternatives the game gives her. She's saying, but there must be another way to do this. And yeah, I'm going to read more, but you have a question?
Just making sure that there are only two options.
Well, the way the story is set up, yes. Should he steal the drug and then his wife and save his wife, or should he not steal the drug and his wife will die? Absolutely, that's the way it's not a check the boxes, but that's the way the story is written. Asked why he should not steal the drug, she considers neither property nor law, but rather the effect that theft could have on the relationship between Heinz and his wife. So this is Amy again. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail. And then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they should really just talk it out and find some other way to make the money. Seeing in the dilemma not a math problem with humans, but a narrative of relationships that extend over time, Amy envisions the wife's continuing need for her husband and the husband's continuing concern for his wife, and seeks to respond to the druggist's need in a way that would sustain rather than sever connection. Right? So these people are going to continue to need the druggist. The druggist is going to continue to need to be there selling the drug. The wife is going to continue to need her husband. The husband is going to continue to need to care for his wife. And just getting the right answer might wreck the larger set of relationships on which everyone depends. So, just as she ties the wife's survival to the preservation of relationships, so she considers the value of the wife's life in a context of relationships, saying that it would be wrong to let her die because, quote, if she died, it hurts a lot of people, and it hurts her. Since Amy's moral judgment is grounded in the belief that, quote, if somebody has something that would keep somebody alive, then it's not right not to give it to them. She considers the problem in the dilemma to arise not from the druggist's assertion of rights, that'd be property rights, but from his failure of response. That is, if the druggist understands that the wife will die, he should find a way to make an arrangement to help her live. So what you see, and what Gilligan argues here, is that the way these girls see the world, they see it as a sort of tissue of relationships that is in danger of being broken, whereas men see it as a problem that needs to be solved for which there should be a right answer, and they want to get the right answer that is morally good. Now, she ends up arguing that both those kinds of morality are fundamental in human relationships. She does not go off saying, oh, see, the girl really understands that we're all social creatures. She actually ends up with quite a complex philosophical position in which these are two different aspects of the moral world, and both need to be taken care of, respected. So, but again, this is a very powerful and recognizable picture of the different ways women and men orient themselves in the world, and essentially men giving more priority to certain kinds of clear, right answers to complex moral questions, and women being more entangled in complex relational issues. And again, I want to repeat that this is certainly not true for everyone. These are statistical tendencies. There are lots of men who think in relational ways. There are lots of women, I know several, who think in these more analytically coherent sort of moral hierarchy type ways. But I think, again, this is a recognizable pattern. And I'm going to suggest some reasons why in a minute. The second kind of social influence that I think accounts for some of why gender differences seem so persistent, even without, I would argue, a deep base either in biology or in deeply internalized personality, is that this is what we talked about last time, gender identity. So that to the degree that your identity is always publicly available, and if we go back to the lecture, the first lecture on socialization where I talked about George Herbert Mead and taking the role of the other, even when you are by yourself, you have internalized a great deal about how others in the social world would see you. And so I think another very important part of gender difference in behavior comes from the fact that gender identity is, for most people, very well anchored, very fundamental to the sense of self, very important. But what it is that gets attached to that identity can be highly variable. And here's where what look like deeply internalized motives turn out to be, so there is something deeply internalized. It's this, the gender identity, and that's a hook. But what it can hook onto can vary hugely, historically, with different kinds of publicity and popular culture and so forth. So here, if we go back to the Martina Horner fear of success experiment, it looks as though what happened between the early 1970s and the late 1990s is that it no longer became gender threatening for women to be successful. So that you could still feel, women could still feel sexy and female and whatever else was important to them about being gendered beings and be first in their medical school classes. Indeed, we know that increasingly, just to take the stereotype, doctors no longer marry their nurses or their receptionists. They increasingly marry other doctors. So male doctors marry female doctors, and female doctors marry male doctors. This is one of the sources of widening social inequality. Female lawyers marry male lawyers. And so the idea that a woman who got too much education or was too successful would essentially become undesirable, unmarriageable, of no interest to the opposite sex, or would simply no longer be seen as female. So even if it wasn't about finding a partner, if it were just about how you're seen, again, we have a lot of evidence that before the women's movement, essentially, and I don't know whether it's the politics of the women's movement or just the broad entry of women into the paid workforce, but the degendering properties of being successful faded away. So that it was really true, and I started graduate school right at the beginning of this period, and I actually know this. At the time I started graduate school, first of all, there were no women, as in zero, on the Berkeley sociology faculty, and there were almost no women on the faculty in the whole university. But the sociology department did have 2 women lecturers, and those are people hired just to teach, but without real faculty positions. And they were, predictably, one was a stereotypical battle axe, wore masculine style suits, short cropped gray hair, no style, no earrings, no nothing. So the sort of stereotypically de-feminized type. She taught statistics. And the other bad stereotype was a totally hysterical person who seemed to have no concept that she could be competent, in control, have mastery. She was very smart, actually brilliant, but she had this kind of massive black curls that hung down her back in a way that really wasn't appropriate to her age, and she was late all the time, and she could never get things done all the time, and she was always in crisis all the time, and making her being in crisis a public scene. Those were the kinds of way you could be a woman and be an academic. And there just weren't any ways to be, quote, normal as a female human being and be an academic. They just weren't. And partly, again, the hysterical one with all the black curls and so forth, she had waited, I think she didn't go to graduate school till her kids were older and she was in her 40s already, and then she, being a graduate student, made her very poor and she couldn't, you know, keep up with all her obligations. I mean, there were sort of objective reasons, but the main thing is that culturally, there was no way of reading an identity as both female and professional that worked. That was a feature not of people's inner psyches. That was a feature of the world. That's why men said that John was going to be incredibly, men and women said that John was going to be incredibly successful if he was #1 in his medical school class, and men and women thought that Mary was going to be unsuccessful, right? And that is part of what changed. And I want to basically talk briefly. How many of you have ever seen Beauty and the Beast? Oh, good, wonderful. Well, those of you who haven't, it's probably not in Moffat, but you should rent it or something. It's a beautiful Disney cartoon that I watched many, many times with my children. And what's cool about it is that it very, very strongly signals this recoding of gender identities, particularly for men. So in a way, if you remember the story, and again, this is not the real Beauty and the Beast, this is the Disney version. Beauty is incredibly beautiful and all men want her, but she is a feisty, fiery personality, not a sweet bubblehead, and she's very intellectual, so she's always reading a book. And the men can't understand, why is she reading a book? Why isn't she paying attention to them? And meanwhile, there are these stereotypical blonde bubbleheads who are always chasing after the men and not having a thought in their head, and they're not nearly as attractive as this incredibly passionate but strong-willed but smart intellectual beauty. But the really interesting gender trick is played on the masculinity side. So the anti-hero, and anybody, Hans? What's his name? What? Gaston. Oh, Gaston. Yes. How could I forget? Okay. Yes. Is a huge, over-muscled, square-jawed, huge steins of beer drinking, violent hunter, you know, heads all over the walls of animals he's killed, a hulking Hulk. But actually, as he goes by a mirror, he looks in the mirror and kind of simpers at himself because he thinks he's so cool, right? So his masculinity is big, bad, and brutal, but hollow. And the beast, who is a beast, ugly and so forth, although he gets transformed into a blonde god at the end, but let's not go there. I always felt that was like such a betrayal of the real themes. But anyway, so the beast is ugly and has deep inner pain and has captured Beauty and so forth. But why does Beauty fall in love with the beast? Because he is gentle and nurturant. So the critical scene in the film is one in which he's kneeling down trying to feed birdseed to these little birds. And he does something awkward. I can't remember if he drops something or he scares the birds, but at any rate, he does something lovably awkward in his attempt to be nurturant and gentle. And that's when she realizes that he's the one she really loves. He's the true mensch, to use the expression for a real man who's a real human being. And so what this is doing, it's not telling you don't care about your gender identity. It's not telling you that at all. It's telling you your gender identity can be fulfilled. You can be a real man by being gentle and nurturant and loving and honest and true and kind and taking care of your children. And it's telling women you can be a real woman by being strong and assertive and smart and successful. And that is the way in which external culture, not the deep motives you learned when you were a baby, but changes in the wider set of social signals around you can radically transform your behavior. Not because it's transformed something deep inside. The deep inside thing has to be there. You have to care about your gender identity for this to work. But that itself can be a lever for radical changes in behavior and social experience. And we've seen this across not just Beauty and the Beast, but another example I won't go into here, but is the degree to which women have learned to play competitive sports. And that learning, now I don't think anybody's done a really good book on college team sports and whether the way they're played is how much these factors, the cooperation competition thing, alter the way sports are played. So do women who win, for example, try to reassure or comfort the person they just beat in a way that men would not? And I don't know whether that's true or not. Although in male sports you also see, I mean, gender is just fascinating, and the degree to which, earrings have become appropriate garb for men. I mean, when I was a child, my father wouldn't wear any jewelry at all because he thought it was unmasculine. And I don't know now that may show he had some worry about being sufficiently masculine or whatever, but the idea that men would wear earrings was absolutely unthinkable. Absolutely unthinkable, say 40 years ago. And now it's become standard gear for many, many men, and for athletes, all of them have big diamonds, and I mean, that's just become the standard thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that the behaviors can shift very dramatically because what things signals about the self can be recoded, right? And that's not something that happens inside you, it's something that happens in the wider world. And this happens in all sorts of ways. So even if we look beyond gender, what does it mean to be a good person, for example? That might be another identity that's important to many people, just the sense that I'm a good person. But is a good person one who is unfailingly polite and always says please and thank you and opens the door and stands back for other people? Or is a good person one who might not have great manners, but whose friends know they can count on her in a crisis? And the way in which good person is defined can reshape people's behavior in powerful ways, even without reshaping their internalized motives. And that's the point. Okay, now continuing with sex differences and watching my time, there are a set of experimental studies of sex differences that are absolutely fascinating. And a woman named Alice Eagley pulled together a huge number of studies and did what's called a meta-analysis. And I won't go into this, but I'll just say it takes the quantitative data from many, many studies and combines it into one big analysis. And they weight the data depending on the quality of the original study. But it means that a study done with 25 people and another one done with 40 people and another few done with 15 and 25 and so forth, eventually you can get a sample size big enough to do really sophisticated analysis. And she studied 3 of the important social traits that are considered to really differentiate women's and men's behavioral styles. And one is altruism, and this is the question of whether you will help someone else who's in trouble. And these are the studies about whether if someone drops papers, that's one of the standard, will people rush to help pick them up? But it's also whether people will intervene in a crisis when someone else is in trouble. So they actually stage these lab experiments in which you're sitting in a room waiting for your study to begin. You've come in as a subject in an experimental study, and you hear a crisis unfolding next door. You hear somebody start to say, well, I won't do that, leave me alone, and then the other person says, get down or whatever, and then the person's screaming, help me, help me. Will you go help? So these are both helpfulness in general, and they are interventions in sometimes frightening situations. And what she found is that women are, on average, less likely to help than men are, but that effect is almost completely determined by how scary the situation is. So it's not that women want to help less, it's that women literally lack the skills to help. Meaning that it's not true of everyone, but most women have never been in a fist fight. I used to think about this. I wouldn't know how to ball my hand up to hit anyone. I'd probably just get my fingers broken. I mean, I literally have never had an occasion to have to hit anyone, and I've never done it, and I don't know how to do it effectively, and I never took a self-defense class, which is really bad. And so I would be frightened to enter a situation, whereas many men, even if they do not themselves have a violent bone in their bodies, have in elementary school and high school had to defend themselves. And so many, many men have an actual experience of physical conflict to draw on as a skill they need in order to intervene. So the difference is heavily dependent on the difference in skills. The second set of studies are studies of aggression. And here, aggression can be measured in many different ways. And it turns out that women are less aggressive than men, as you would predict from everything we believe about gender, except that the difference largely disappears if the form of aggression, so they measure aggression in many, many different ways, but one of them is your chance to basically ding someone else's score on a test or something like that. And if women can be aggressive in a way that will not get them in trouble and will not be defined as having been antisocial, so essentially they're the ones checking on the other person on behalf of the teacher or whatever, they end up being just as aggressive as men. So the suggestion is that it's the social, they're sensitive to being seen, to aggression being seen as socially inappropriate, right? But they don't have any less motive to be aggressive than men. So what restrains them is both if they lack the skill to be aggressive, so in a physical conflict they won't, or if it is seen as socially inappropriate behavior that could reflect badly on their gender identity. And then the third set of studies is the most fascinating, and these are studies of empathy. And the way they usually do this is that they put people in a lab situation, and then they show them a film of a baby screaming in tears or somebody being hurt, and they measure their physiological response to the suffering of others. And that's empathy, how much you suffer when you see others suffering. Well, it turns out that if you ask men and women how they experience other people's discomfort, women claim to be much more upset than men. So the crying baby, the person being injured, the car crash, the injury on the football field, sorry. Women will say they're more upset than men. If you put people in a group setting, so they're all wired up to these physiological meters, but they're a mixed group in a room, the difference is reduced. So women are still slightly more empathetic than men, but the difference is smaller. But if you put people by themselves so no one else is observing them, the physiological difference disappears. So essentially, how public the behavior is, how much it fits your role, and how much it ties into your skills turn out to drive these very important differences. So I'm not arguing the differences aren't real. They're very real. And they're out there and they shape different behaviors every day. I'm just arguing that where the differences are located is not in the deepest part of people's motives, but in their internalized understanding of the expectations other people have of them, and the style, skills, and habits they've developed over a lifetime. Okay.